The day I signed the papers on my new house, I poured myself a glass of sweet tea, sat down on the back porch, and just listened to the quiet. 63 years old. No mortgage, no debt. A three-bedroom craftsman on a half-acre lot outside Asheville, North Carolina, with a covered porch, a creek you could hear at night, and not a single person in the world who knew my address. That last part wasn't an accident. I want to be honest with you about something. I'm not a man who chases drama. Never was. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer, showed up on time, kept my head down, raised my daughter the best I knew how after her mother passed. I am not, by nature, someone who airs his family's business to strangers. But what happened last spring was something I've been carrying around long enough, and carrying it alone isn't doing me any good anymore. So here it is. My daughter's name is Ingrid. She's 37 now. I named her after her grandmother, my mother, who was the toughest and most loving woman I ever knew. For the first 20-some years of Ingrid's life, I thought she'd grown up to be just like her. She was sharp, independent, had a mouth on her that could peel paint, but a heart that more than made up for it. I was proud of her in the way that makes your chest ache a little when you think about it. Then she married her husband, Theo, and I know that name's on the used list, so let me be clear. I'm calling him something else. His name was Douglas. Doug. And Doug was the kind of man who could make you feel small in a room full of people without ever raising his voice. The first time I met him at a dinner Ingrid arranged at a restaurant in Charlotte, he spent 45 minutes talking about himself and another 15 telling me, with a smile, that my engineering career must have been comfortable if not exactly ambitious. I let it go. He was nervous, I told myself. First time meeting the father. But it wasn't nerves. That was just Doug. He worked in finance. Some kind of fund management I never fully understood, and he made good money at it. Enough money that Ingrid slowly stopped working her own job, stopped seeing her own friends, stopped calling me every Sunday the way she always had. A year after the wedding, our calls went from weekly to monthly. A year after that, they mostly stopped. I drove to Charlotte once unannounced just to see her. Doug opened the door. He looked at me the way you look at a neighbor's dog that's wandered onto your lawn. Not angry, just inconvenienced. He told me Ingrid was resting and then she'd call me later. She didn't call for 6 weeks. When she finally did, she was polite, pleasant even. But there was a flatness in her voice I didn't recognize. She said Doug felt I was creating stress in the marriage and that she needed me to give them some space. I asked her what I'd done. She said I knew what I'd done. I asked again. She said she'd talk to me when she was ready. That was 11 years ago. I want you to understand what 11 years of silence from your only child feels like. Because I think most people underestimate it. It is not like a fight. Fights have edges. Fights have noise. This was more like a slow drain. Every holiday that passed, every birthday, every morning I pick up my phone out of habit and put it back down. I went to a grief counselor for a while, a woman in Knoxville who specialized in estrangement, and she told me the research on parent-child estrangement shows it's one of the most under-acknowledged forms of grief there is. I believe that. I lived it. What I did not do was fall apart. I had been doing some consulting work on the side for most of my career. Nothing dramatic, smaller firms who needed structural assessments on commercial properties. The kind of work that doesn't make headlines but keeps buildings standing. After I retired from my firm at 60, I went full-time into the consulting practice. It grew faster than I expected. I brought in a partner, a younger engineer named, well, I'll just call him my partner, and within 3 years we had contracts across 4 states. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I became a millionaire overnight. I will tell you that by the time I turned 62, I had more money than I'd ever expected to have, and a life that was genuinely mine. I sold my share of the practice for a number I still find a little hard to say out loud. I bought the house in Asheville. I got a dog, a big, dumb golden retriever named Biscuit, who has never once made me feel bad about anything. And for the first time in 11 years, I felt something close to peace. I should have known it wouldn't last. It was a Tuesday morning in late March when my neighbor, a retired teacher named, I'll call her my neighbor, knocked on my door to tell me a car had been parked at the end of my driveway since the previous evening. She'd noticed it because it was a newer model, a black SUV with Charlotte plates, and it hadn't moved. I thanked her and walked down the driveway. Ingrid was sitting in the passenger seat. She looked thinner than I remembered, and there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there at the wedding. Doug was in the driver's seat. He had on a sport coat, which I remember thinking was strange for a Tuesday morning in a residential neighborhood in Asheville. I knocked on the window. Doug rolled it down and smiled, not the inconvenienced smile from 11 years ago. This was a different one, warmer, practiced. "Harold," he said, "been a long time." My name is Harold Beaumont, and I hadn't heard it in Doug's mouth in over a decade, and somehow it felt like trespassing. I looked at Ingrid. She looked at her hands. I said, "What are you doing here?" Doug said they'd been in the area and thought they'd stop by. I told him I hadn't given anyone my address. He smiled again and said Ingrid had gotten it from an old mutual acquaintance. I didn't ask who. I made a note to find out later. I will be honest. When I saw Ingrid's face, really saw it, something in me that I'd spent 11 years hardening just cracked a little. She was still my daughter. She was still the little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long drives and snore like a grown man, which always made her furious when I told the story. She was still mine, in the way children are yours even when they break your heart. I invited them inside. That was my first mistake, not because I'm weak, but because I am human, and 11 years is a long time, and she was on my porch. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. Doug did most of the talking, as he always had. He told me about a business opportunity he'd been developing, some kind of private investment vehicle, and that he was looking for anchor investors who understood real value. He said he'd always respected my career. He said he knew we'd had our differences. He said Ingrid had really missed me and that they both wanted to repair things. I listened. I am a structural engineer. I spent 31 years assessing whether things were built to hold weight. And I can tell you that within about 10 minutes of sitting at that table, I had assessed Douglas completely. The structure was rotten. I asked him calmly what he needed from me specifically. He laid out a number, a significant number, an investment in his fund, structured in a way that would apparently preserve my liquidity while generating meaningful returns. He had a folder. He slid it across the table. I looked at the folder. I looked at Ingrid. She was staring at the table. I said, "Does she know she's here to help you ask me for money?" The room went very quiet. Doug's smile tightened. He said this wasn't about money. It was about family and opportunity and mending what had been broken. He said I was being uncharitable. He said he'd expected this kind of resistance. I said, "Ingrid, look at me." She looked up, and what I saw in her eyes was something I hadn't expected. Not guilt, exactly. Not manipulation. Something more like exhaustion. Like a person who has been carrying something for a very long time and has simply run out of places to put it down. I said, "How long have things been bad?" She opened her mouth. Doug put his hand on the table, not touching her, just placing it there. It was the smallest gesture, and she closed her mouth. I pushed back from the table and stood up. I told Doug that I was going to ask him to leave. Not because I was angry, I told him, but because I was tired. 11 years of silence, and the first conversation he'd arranged was a pitch meeting. I told him I hoped the fund did well. I told him I hoped a lot of things. He didn't leave right away. He talked for a while longer about how I was being emotional, about how this was exactly the behavior Ingrid had described, the stubbornness, the inability to let things go. He said it with great patience, the way you talk to someone you've decided is unreasonable. I walked to the front door and opened it. He eventually walked through it. Ingrid stood up to follow him. At the door, she paused. She didn't look at me. She said quietly, "I didn't know he was going to bring the folder." I said, "I know." She left. I stood on the porch and watched the black SUV back out of my driveway. Biscuit came and sat next to me, which he does when I'm standing still too long. I scratched behind his ears. The creek was running loud that morning. It had rained the night before. I went inside and I made another pot of coffee and I sat down and I thought for a very long time. Here is the part of the story where I want to be careful. Because I am not a vindictive man. I am not telling you the story because I want applause for what came next. I am telling it because what I did next came from a place of genuine clarity, not anger. And I think that distinction matters. I called a friend of mine, a man I've known since graduate school, who spent his career in financial regulation and compliance before retiring. I'm going to call him my old friend. I told him Doug's name. I told him about the folder. I told him about the fund. My old friend said he'd make some calls. What he found over the following 2 weeks was not surprising but was worse than I'd expected. The investment vehicle Doug was promoting had been flagged in 2 states for failing to properly register with securities regulators. There were complaints from other investors, not many but enough. Nothing had risen to the level of prosecution yet. But it was the kind of situation where the noose was tightening, and Doug was clearly looking for fresh capital to buy himself time. My old friend told me what he thought I should do. I thanked him and told him I'd think about it. I also, in those 2 weeks, did something else. I wrote Ingrid a letter. A real one on paper, mailed to the address I had for them. I told her I wasn't going to invest in the fund. I told her what my old friend had found, plainly and without drama. I told her I was concerned about her financial situation. I told her that whatever she thought of me, whatever Doug had told her over the years, I was her father, and if she ever needed help, she could call me, and I would answer. I told her I loved her. I didn't hear back for 9 days. On the 10th day, she called from a number I didn't recognize. She was crying. Not the kind of crying that wants a response, the kind that just needs to be heard. She told me she'd known for almost 2 years that something was wrong. She told me she'd found statements, discrepancies, emails she wasn't supposed to see. She told me that every time she tried to raise it with Doug, she ended up somehow apologizing. She told me she'd been scared. I listened to all of it. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't say anything about the 11 years. None of that mattered in that moment. I said, "Where are you right now?" She was at a friend's house. She had her car and 2 bags. She hadn't told Doug she was leaving. I told her to stay where she was. I drove to Charlotte that afternoon, 4.5 hours, Biscuit in the back seat, which he likes because he can watch the highway. I got there at 9:30 at night. She was sitting on her friend's front steps. She looked like someone who had just put down something very heavy. She stood up when she saw my headlights and she walked to the car, and she got in the passenger seat and she didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I know." We drove back to Asheville that night. She slept most of the way. Biscuit, to his credit, rested his chin on her shoulder for approximately 3 hours, which is more comfort than most people can offer. What happened with Doug came out over the following months. The regulatory complaints were formalized. There was an investigation. I won't go into all the details because honestly some of it is still working its way through the system, but what I'll say is that the structure, as I had assessed it, did not hold. It collapsed in the way bad structures always do. Not all at once, but in stages, each stage more embarrassing than the last. Doug had a lawyer, and then Doug had a different lawyer, and then Doug had a very bad couple of months. I'm not going to pretend I felt nothing watching that. I am human. There was something satisfying about it, and I think being honest about that is more useful than pretending I was above it. But here's what I actually care about. My daughter got a job. She has a good head for numbers, always did, and she found a position with a firm in Asheville doing financial analysis, which I mention not because it's impressive, but because she found it herself, and that matters. She has her own apartment now, a nice one, on the other side of town. with windows that face east so she gets the morning light. She comes for dinner on Sundays. We've had some hard conversations at that table about the 11 years, about what she believed, about why she stayed as long as she did. None of those conversations have been comfortable. Some of them have left me sitting alone on the porch afterward, listening to the creak and trying to make sense of things. But they've been honest conversations. And honest is something I can work with. Last Sunday, she brought groceries and made her grandmother's chicken and dumplings, a recipe I had somehow managed to keep in the family on an index card in a kitchen drawer for 40 years. She hadn't made it since she was maybe 19. It tasted exactly right. Biscuit sat under her chair the entire dinner, which is his way of saying he approves. I am 63 years old. I have a house with a creek and a porch and a dog and a daughter who looks me in the eye now when she talks to me. I have more peace than I have had in longer than I can remember. I did not get here by being hard. I did not get here by being hard. I did not get here by being soft. I got here by being patient and honest, and by refusing, eventually, to let the people who meant to diminish me have the last word. That folder Doug slid across my kitchen table is in my filing cabinet. I kept it, not as a trophy, as a reminder. The structure was rotten, and I knew it, and I held my ground, and the rest took care of itself. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, trying to figure out what it actually means. Not the version where I'm the hero, the honest version. What I know is this. The way things ended was not an accident. Not luck, not fate. It was the direct result of choices. Mine, Doug's, Ingrid's, stacked on top of each other over 11 years until the weight of them finally had nowhere left to go but down. Doug made a career out of reading people. He found the ones who wanted to believe in something, and he gave them a reason to. He was smart about it. I'll give him that. But smart without integrity is just a sharper tool for doing damage. He built his whole life on the assumption that people could be managed, that loyalty could be manufactured, that if you controlled the information someone had access to, you controlled them. And for a long time with Ingrid, it worked. Not because she was weak, but because she loved him, and love will make a person ignore a lot of things they'd otherwise see clearly. The moment she stopped ignoring it, the moment she found those statements and sat with what they meant, that was the moment his whole structure started to crack. He hadn't counted on her being strong enough to walk out with 2 bags and sit on a friend's front steps and make a phone call she'd been putting off for over a decade. That took something. Real something. The kind that doesn't come from being told you're brave. It comes from being pushed past the point where the fear of staying is finally bigger than the fear of leaving. I think about what it cost me to stay patient all those years. Not to chase her, not to force a reconciliation, not to show up at their door the way he showed up at mine. There were nights, a lot of them, where patience felt indistinguishable from giving up. I kept going because I had made a decision early on that I was not going to become someone I didn't recognize in the name of getting my daughter back. Whatever happened, I was going to keep my character intact. That mattered to me more than winning. And here's what I've learned. At 63, in a house by a creek in Asheville, the people who see you clearly, not the version of you they need you to be, but actually you, are the ones worth holding on to. Doug never saw me. He saw an asset, and then an obstacle. Ingrid, and her best, has always seen me. That was worth waiting for. The folder is still in my filing cabinet. I haven't looked at it in months. I kept it because I wanted a physical reminder of what dishonesty actually looks like when you lay it flat on a table. It looks very ordinary. That's the part that stays with me. I don't think life distributes justice on any particular schedule. I don't think good people are protected by their goodness, or that bad ones always answer for what they do. But I do think that how you conduct yourself, whether you stay honest when it costs you, whether you keep thinking clearly when your emotions are telling you to stop, whether you get back up after 11 years of quiet grief and build something real anyway, that shapes what's available to you when the door finally opens. The door opened. I was still standing there. That's enough for me.